APNU AFC Afternoon Rush. My name is Christopher Jones, sitting in for my colleague RANDOLPH CRITCHLOW, who have some technical difficulties at his location. On today's program, we want to look at extensively matters that are coming up in the National Assembly tomorrow, and that has to do with the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act and the raising of the internal and external debt ceiling. And so to walk us through this discussion, we have former Minister of Finance, Mr. Winston Jordan, and former Minister of Public Security, Mr. Kemraj Ramchitan. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you, and a very good afternoon, Chris. It's lovely to be here once again, and good to see my good friend Winston there too.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon to you and your viewers. Good afternoon, Kemraj. Good to see you.
Look, I want to hear a lot from Winston this afternoon. This is a financial and fiscal matter, and he had given a lovely speech on these matters. And let's hear him again. I will be de minimis. I don't mind.
Excellent. Mr. Jordan, well, you heard it there. So essentially tomorrow in the National Assembly, amongst several bills and motions that will be coming from the PPP, inclusive of the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. I know this matter was came to the National Assembly subject to correction in the 10th Parliament. It was debated upon by Mr. Carl Greenidge at that time as an opposition MP. The APNU AFC administration in 2015 brought that fiscal management accountability, and it was successfully passed in the National Assembly. Before we get to the other two bills, the motions that are coming, which essentially deals with the raising of the internal and the external debt ceiling, walk our viewers through in terms of this Fiscal Management and Accountability Act, what is currently obtained, and what the People's Progressive Party is trying to achieve, and how detrimental it is to Guyana and Guyanese.
Well, Chris, you have a good chapeau opening to it, really. Essentially, it was to give greater independence and autonomy to the constitutional agencies. You see, prior to August, when the bill was assented to, of 2015, constitutional agencies were treated as budget agencies. For those who don't know, budget agencies are described in the schedule to the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. And those agencies include agencies such as the various ministries, several departments, like the Guyana Defense Force, and the regional administrations, regions 1 to 10. Right, so prior to 2015, it would have also included all of the constitutional agencies such as Director of Public Prosecutions, Parliament Office, Supreme Court, the General's Office, and so on. And so once they were budget agencies, their monies had to be appropriated, as opposed to having a claim on the consolidated fund, as all constitutional agencies in accordance with the Constitution are supposed to have. So Carl, I believe it was in the opposition, had introduced this motion to separate these agencies from budget agencies and to give them greater freedom in terms of their budgets, in terms of managing their own budget, and in terms of removing the executive in the form of the ministers from determining their budgets and determining what they can do with their budgets. This is a matter that had been fought for, particularly by, and as you know, the courts guard zealously and jealously all matters to do or fall within their domain, including their resources and how they can use the resources. So, for example, if a judge wanted to travel prior to 2015, they had to send a cabinet memo, and cabinet had to sit and determine whether the judge could have traveled to a meeting of judges or so on. With the changes that were made post-August 2015, that did not obtain. So essentially what we did was, one, remove them from being budget agencies, so they were all removed from the schedule to the Fiscal Management Accountability Act. They were now separated. Two, even though they were required to follow all financial regulations and so forth, including circulars, they were going to follow those to the letter, but when they prepared their budgets, they were not going to have it overseen by any minister, but it would have been prepared and submitted directly to the National Assembly, with a copy going to the Minister of Finance and the Speaker of the National Assembly. A date would have been set for the constitutional agency's budget to be heard by the Committee of Supply on their own. And all their budgets, unedited, unaltered, would have been presented to the committee, together with the recommendations of the Minister of Finance as to he could have afforded relative to what they may have asked for. And those would have been debated on the floor. Once a decision would have been made by the Committee of Supply, those decisions were final. And those budgets didn't have to come back to the regular appropriation sessions that will normally take place over 5 days or so when we're going through the budgets of each and every budget agency. Those budgets will no longer have to come in, but will be included as part of the appropriation bill, right? So no longer would those have had to come in. They would have been included as part of the appropriation bill. And 1 month after the appropriation bill would have been passed, the budgets of each constitutional agency had to be given to them in their entirety.
Yeah.
So whereas budget agencies would have had to rely on monthly releases, constitutional agencies within 1 month of the budget, the appropriation act being signed, the bill being passed and the act being signed, would have had their entire sum that was voted transferred to them, and they would have been able to use those budgets as they saw fit, doing the usual reporting back to the ministry, monthly reporting. Their budgets would have remained unaltered, so that even if we run into trouble, say half of the year, and we have to cut back budgets, like for the budget agencies, we couldn't cut a budget of the constitutional agency. We had to go back to the National Assembly and request any cuts. And there it would have had to be debated and so on. So they had a freedom of autonomy from the level of their financial resources that was unheard of, never given to them before. And I think they breathe. What is happening with this bill that is coming up is essentially to revert them to the pre-August 2015 status. That is what they were accustomed to under the previous PPP regime. And all this talk where the Minister responsible for Finance is saying it gives Parliament a total picture of the budget, it's a load of, we like to say claptrap. Because reality is the Parliament would have already seen the budgets of the constitutional agencies in its special session. That is one. Two, we do not bring to the Parliament statutory expenditure. Those expenditures have a forced claim on the consolidated fund, and as such are not voted in the National Assembly. So we do not bring to the National Assembly, to the floor of the National Assembly, the debt that we are going to pay. We do not bring that. And never brought the salaries to be voted for the constitutional office holders even before 2015. This would not have come to the National Assembly because they are statutory expenditures. So if you want a total picture of the budget, you will have to bring all the revenues that are being planned for that year, all the statutory expenditure that are being planned for that year, and all of the appropriation expenditure that has been planned for that year, plus all the proposed borrowing and their sources, and all of that to give Parliament a total picture would have had to be brought to the floor and debated. The reality is that only appropriation expenditure is debated on the floor of our National Assembly. So what Mr. Ashley Singh is talking about, again, is throwing wool or dust in people's eye about fulsome budget being brought to the floor.
The term authoritarian is being used quite often now in the Guyanese society to describe the People's Progressive Party Civic and what is obtained and what is being obtained with them. Would you disagree that this is another move by them to control, as you mentioned, the Parliament, the Auditor General's Office, the DPP, the Department of Public Prosecution, the Supreme Court, and all of that? Is that essentially would you say they use this leverage to control these agencies?
Well, this is exactly the point where I am going to hand over to my good friend. He has a word, an appropriate word, control, freakism, and democratic.
That's right. This might be a nice stage for me to come in because, you know, over the years and also coming from the belly of the beast, Chris, meaning the PDP, you knew how they think. You knew how they dealt with issues. And one such manner of dealing with issues is to have absolute control. And it came as a result of especially the presidency of Barajag Deo. And that is what is happening here. And there is where I coined the term control freakism. They are in every way getting very much authoritarian. There's no doubt in my mind about this. They now are going back to the pre-2015 position, because although we had argued this case in 2013, when Minister wasn't there, Carl Greenidge was there, when we argued this thing, and we passed by a majority that bill, it was not assented to by Donald Ramotar. And of course, President Granger then indicated that once Parliament would have argued and debated and voted for the passage of a bill, he will assent to it. And he did that in 2015. And so we have that. But I have to make this additional point, that what we were doing then and doing in 2015 was to make all these financial and fiscal arrangements and matters dealing with accountability and management in accordance with a constitutional provision which the PPP had supported in 2001, namely a clause on financial autonomy in the constitutional amendment of 2001, number 6, constitutional amendment. And that is that in order to ensure the independence of the constitutional entities listed in the 3rd schedule, which means the various commissions and all of that, the expenditure of each of the entities shall be financed as a direct charge on the consolidated fund. So it will not be an appropriated sum. It will have a consolidated fund charge attached to it, determined as a lump sum. And all of that we did in relation to this 2013, and then later on, the 2015 bill that we passed here under, and which got the assent of President Granger under Winston Jordan's tenureship at Ministry of Finance. And it also goes on to say that the annual subvention approved for these constitutional entities shall be approved by the National Assembly after a review and approval of the entity's annual budget as part of the process for the determination of the national budget. So what we did in 2013 in a private member's bill, and what we did also with a government bill in 2015 is directly in consonance, consistent and compatible with the Constitution that was amended in that big constitutional reform process, number 6 of 2001, to give financial autonomy, as just described by Winston Jordan there. And of course, all these entities, Constitutional Rights Commission, the various other commission, Police Service Commission, Judicial Service Commission, all of them will still have to live with a very deep commitment to probity and propriety in accordance with this same Article 222A, because it goes on to say that they must adopt the practices and procedures approved by the National Assembly to ensure proper accountability. And so it is important that we understand why it is. Now, to go back to what is called the PPP's position, which is not in keeping with that provision, is rather, it's rather scary. And it is going back to a control freakism that we did not want and which we dismantled. But of course, they are now dismantling that to bring back all of these things, so that they and the ministers and the office of the president, under which this Ministry of Finance comes under, now gonna do as they like. And it is indeed, clouding our eyes, putting wool in our eyes, when he is indicating, that is Ashni Singh, is indicating he is now a mouthpiece of Bara Jagdeo, that this control freakism is going to come back. So I wish to make that, because that constitutional amendment is what mandated us and caused us to go the way of ensuring financial autonomy for these constitutional agencies.
Mercy. So in other words, the Guyanese society should be very worried.
Oh yeah, they should be.
The point raised.
I think Vincent is on mute. Just unmute him.
Yeah.
Sorry, if I may just add to what Kemraj had said, the haste within which this bill has been brought. Don't forget, prior to the elections, you heard this government claiming how much bills and so on they had in train to bring. Who would have thought such a bill would have been at the top priority? Never mentioned before. But you know why it's being rushed through right now? My take that it's being rushed at this stage because, if you recall, that Ford had on behalf of the coalition, had filed, I don't know what you call it, charge, whatever, in court about the arrangement that were made in the 2020 budget for the constitutional agencies. His argument is that their budgets violated the existing law. That matter has not been heard as yet, which is unfortunate, because now another budget is coming up. And what they are trying to do, because they violated those laws, is to preempt the decision of the judge.
Right.
When this is passed, that decision will just be nugatory. And they will not have to bring to the special committee of supply the budgets of the constitutional agencies anymore. But instead, they will be rushed through with the regular appropriation budgets in the usual manner, and now be under the control of the subject ministers. So I think that is a very important point that I think is one of the reasons why this bill has been presented, and it's going to be rushed through quickly to avoid the 2021 budget of the constitutional agencies being subjected to the usual arrangements that are now in place.
Right. Both Mr. Jordan and Kemraj, the PPP would want to argue that, listen, this is nothing strange to parliaments or countries in terms of their operation. And they would claim that it could be found in parts of the Caribbean or even internationally. Is that so?
Well, look, because of our constitutional provision, as adumbrated in Constitutional Reform Act 2001, number 6, or number 6 of 2001, those other countries in the world will have a distinction and a distinctly different scenario than ours.
Yeah.
As I read out to you just now, that is what the people of Guyana and the PPP supported unanimously.
That's right.
So you can't go and bring the Commonwealth practice, which might not have this arrangement, because we have the peculiarity of a constitutional provision that says constitutional agencies, entities, as per schedule, and they've set the names of the schedule at the back there, the entities in that schedule. They have to be financially autonomous. And as far as is possible, because you still have to have the Minister of Finance making the arrangements in relation to how it's done. And that is what we did. So to go and say that, oh, this is but the practice in other countries, ask them if the other countries got a financial provision in their constitution identical to 222A of our constitution. It doesn't. So that is what takes care of it. So all this argument that it is all over the place, it's not all over the place, because our place was peculiarly difficult, not difficult, but peculiarly different from the others. And so don't bother with Ashley. Ashley will come with his claptrap again, and all with the purpose of control freakism.
Mercy. All right. Mr. Jordan, you want to close on the financial management, because I want to turn attention to the debt ceilings.
Yeah, I will close and say I once again express my concern with so-called civil society for taking up this matter, particularly the media. Our good friend Mr. Ramkaran, who's a former speaker and so on, with lots of experience and so on. Our good friend Christopher Ram, who writes very copiously and prodigiously on a range of matters. I'm surprised that such well-known commentators have not taken up this issue already and its implications for the independence of the constitutional agency. So I remain very, very, very hopeless where these matters are concerned, and the role or the lack of a role that the civil society is playing post-August the 2nd, and post-August the 2nd, since our government has limited office.
Yeah. Some would want to put this in somewhat of an emancipation scenario, that in 2015, all of these agencies, the Department of Public Prosecution, the Supreme Court, the Parliament, the Auditor General's office, obtained emancipation, that they were free to manage their sums, their monies, their expenditures, and so forth. And here it is now that the PPP back in office and essentially have withdrawn that from them. As well, tomorrow, amongst the items that are coming in the National Assembly, it speaks to two motions, speaks to the increasing of the debt ceiling, both internal and external. There is an argument being put forward. I recall in subject to correction in 2013, I think it was, in which Ashley Singh claimed that as a result of the opposition then, which had the majority and did not approve for the debt ceilings to be increased, that is what caused the downfall. And I know there will be some of their arguments via the media going forward. For the benefit of the viewers, could you walk us through what is the internal ceiling that they want to increase, as well as what are those and what is the impact on the Guyanese society?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't realize you were speaking to. Well, look, debt ceilings are exactly what they are. They are the maximum that any government can borrow within a certain period in relation to domestic borrowing and in relation to external borrowing. So The external borrowing is covered by the External Loans Act, and the domestic borrowing by the Public Debt Borrowing Act. But let's step back and understand borrowing, put borrowing in context. No budget for the government of Guyana, certainly post independence, has been balanced. No budget. And I even believe even before independence, was there ever a balanced budget here? And that is not something that is peculiar to Guyana. Many developing countries, even some of the rich ones, don't have balanced budget. Even United States don't have a balanced budget. What you tend to strive for is to mobilize domestic savings, principally at the level of government, to cover at least your current expenditure. That is your expenditure on wages and salaries, operation costs, and including interest on the debt. Okay? And whatever is left over is supposed to cover development expenditure. Unfortunately, our savings, as I said, domestic savings, is low and cannot cover the level of development expenditure that we wish to execute in a given year. So we have to resort to borrowing. And we can make up the difference between the residual savings and the amount required to finance the development expenditure by borrowing locally and borrowing externally. Locally, we borrow short by issuing of treasury bills and other instruments. Right now, we are only issuing treasury bills. And we borrow long by issuing debentures. Right now, we are not issuing any debentures, by issuing things such as bonds and so forth. Years ago, I was telling somebody, we don't do bonds now, but years ago, we had defense bonds that were raised to purchase arms in face of the same Venezuelan controversy that we had many years ago. And I believe sometime back in around 1994, I believe, the then Minister of Finance, Asghar Ali, had put out, I believe, $1 billion of bonds, which I believe were gobbled up by one commercial bank at the time. It was meant to be 2 billion, but I think after the 1 billion, I think they scrapped the next billion. So that is borrowing from the domestic market, financial market, so to speak. And then, of course, you have external borrowing, where we borrow from multilateral financial institutions like the IDB, the Caribbean Development Bank, the World Bank, for example, the International Monetary Fund, of course, and they have a number of other multilateral agencies. And we could also borrow from friendly bilateral agencies, United States, Canada, Far East, like Kuwait, and so on and so forth. So that is the general thrust of things. And so you have a limit of how much you can borrow externally and a limit of what you could borrow locally. Now, the issue here is not that we are not in favor of borrowing for developmental purposes. The issue here is the pitching of the limit to such frightening levels as to ring alarm bells, so to speak. Because a country has to manage its domestic resources, come what may, to propel development. And borrowing should only be last resort. So you can't substitute the absence of proper domestic policies for external borrowing. And you're going to see why soon. Because while in some periods borrowing may be cheap, especially what happened during the 1970s when the world was flush with petrodollars and they wanted to get rid of it, and therefore they were lending like hell until the bubble burst. And until recently, right here in Guyana, where we were able to get some very small loans at virtually cheap to no interest rate, the most recent being a World Bank loan that came through for the education sector, where very favorable terms of 0 interest rate, 10 years repayment, and 10 years grace period, and 40 years grace. A lot of the borrowing for Guyana, especially on the external front, is turning to what we call hard. Reason being, Guyana is consistently being viewed as an upper middle income country, even though we don't feel like an upper middle income country. But like about 2 years ago, Guyana was graduated in the World Bank to an upper middle income country. And even though we still get, and we still have access to that institution's soft window, the time is nigh when we will be completely graduated from the soft window and ultimately graduated from the hard window, which is the World Bank proper. For example, Barbados doesn't receive any kind of World Bank loan because they have been graduated from that institution in its entirety. That is because of their status of being upper middle income. Bahamas is the same thing. So we are going to be increasingly forced on the external front to borrow at market interest rates, thus making our borrowing expensive. And if we are going to be borrowing this kind of money for developmental projects, for which A, we seem not to be able to do a feasibility study for, and B, in cases where we have done the feasibility, the rates of return are far lower than the rate at which we potentially can borrow. We are placing a burden on this current and future generations of a debt only seen in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. It took a long climb out of the valley of debt, a long, long climb out of the valley of debt to bring us to where we are. And to see this mismanagement of the country's resources and this callous regard for prudent fiscal and debt management, to see it in this massive raising of the ceiling on both the domestic and external front is nothing short of recklessness.
Mercy. Kemraj, what your views? I don't know if by chance, Mr. Jordan, if we have lost Kemraj. All right, so we'll just continue.
No, I am on.
Okay.
No, I just want to concur with my senior in these financial and fiscal matters, and he has gotten it bang on. This is exactly where the point is, where they want to have monies to spend, and really to politically show off that. But this is going to be where the problem. This is going to be affecting future generations, as was mentioned by Winston Jordan there. This is not a good thing. It is far more than merely reckless, in my opinion. And the PPP came from a political party led by Dr. Jagan that used to be very critical of these kinds of what you call frightening levels of debt, saying that the thing is bad. I remember him telling me and the young PYO members those days in lectures that we must always try as best to go to a balanced budget so that we can get the monies through taxation, we can get the monies through the general other means of revenue from the various company and so on, whatever Gaisuko is making profits from, and so on. And that is how we're going to spend. So if you earn $500 million, that is what your budget must be. Unless, of course, there's need for developmental projects, which you must ensure that you have a capacity to spend it. In Guyana, with this kind of level of, we can very well see that you can borrow, and then you don't have the contractors to build the bridges or to do this and to do that and things like that. And that is where there can be massive corruption. And both Barajagdeo and Ashni should know this. And to go then, and we had made arguments similar to that in relation to, I think, the hydroelectric scheme that they had. Yes, right. So all of that was brought out there. And we had come to a median. I remember the Alliance for Change Parliamentarians voted with them 2 weeks after we had closed it off. We then came back, and from 1 billion as a maximum limit, I think we then carried it up to 50 billion. Of course, under Winston Jordan's time, we had moved it up, I think, somewhat higher.
No,
But well, what had happened?
we kept it at 50 billion.
You kept it at 50 billion. Okay, good.
But we
Right.
expanded the narrative to accommodate the 30
Other
billion
projects.
that we took, the 30 billion bond that we took for Gaisuku.
Oh yes, right.
Right.
I will have to read the Hansard on it. I have it in front of me.
We put in the phrase "and other developmental activities."
That's right.
Because
That's
it was only specific, as it stood at that time, it was only specific to the Amalia Falls story.
Ah, that's correct. That's correct.
So we put in the phrase "and other developmental activities" to cover the bond, the 30 billion bond that we took for Gaisuku.
Gaisuku, yeah. Thanks very much for that reminder.
Yes, as I have the floor, let me put in some additional points to you, Chris.
Sure.
Look, again, as I said, we are not disputing that you need to borrow for developmental projects, but Kemraj gave a timely reminder. Our history of executing large projects is PPP is well known, and he talked about the Amalia Falls, but our greatest albatross is the Skeldon Estate, 200 million US.
Wow.
A project that was meant to increase our foreign exchange earning and have the capacity and capability to repay its debts. Today, that burden is being carried by taxpayers. Taxpayers. Another project called the Marriott Hotel. They took a loan from Republic Bank, over 16 million US dollars. Marriott Hotel could not pay back the loan. Under my stewardship, we had to take over the loan and bring it onto the central government's books. CLICO of NIS lost over $5 billion in CLICO. They could not pay that. CLICO could not pay them back. That debt had to come on to the government books, and that is now being paid for by taxpayers. Taxpayers, instead of NIS getting back their money together with the interest income. So the point we're saying here is, again, we're making it, is that we recognize that you need to borrow for developmental purposes. But the scary thing is, and put the limit there, is that they've gone out there to borrow monies for these projects that appear to be sexy. Bridge across the Demerara River, even though no feasibility study has been done for the bridge at the point at which they want to put it. At the point at which they want to put it. Gas to shore, to Wales, no feasibility study. And so you have these massive projects that's going to make Skeldon, look like a footpath.
Yeah.
In terms of the price and cost of the borrowing. Right? So we don't see where the feasibility. So let me tell you something. Our neighbor Suriname built 3 massive bridges that the economy could not maintain. And up to today, Suriname is feeling the effects of that gross mismanagement. They're feeling the effects, and those who go to Suriname say, "Oh, lovely bridges," and so on. But it wrecked the economy. So it's not. So we have to be frightened, Chris. We have to be frightened, because when you borrow,
you have to pay back.
You have to pay back. And you can only pay back by raising taxes and government revenue. You can't borrow to pay back borrowing. You have to get it from tax revenue. But guess what? In the 2020 budget, instead of strengthening government revenue and continue to broaden the tax base as was done under the coalition government, the PPP rolled back almost every measure that was designed to broaden the tax base, but did not put in place measures to help the small man. You had no income tax changes for the small man. You had no threshold changes for the small man and so forth. But you had widespread removal of taxes for a small set of people in the private sector. So rather than broadening the base and depending on your domestic policies to drive your growth, you have now replaced it with borrow and spend. As I like to say, they like used to say about how we had the mantra tax and spend, even though we did not bring in a single new tax. They have now changed from tax and spend mantra to borrow and spend. And like I said to you just now, our borrowing is going to become increasingly expensive because of our per capita income that has gone up significantly. When you put all of that together, you see where we are heading to. One last point before you hand over. Mr. Ashley Singh appeared to be on record as being quoted in the DPI that one of the reasons why he's raising the local debt limit is because when he came in 2020, he met a situation left by the coalition government. Let me tell you, over the 5 years of the coalition government, it's in their estimates, go to page 3 of their estimates. The coalition accumulated $92 billion in deficits, as reflected in the overdraft at the Bank of Guyana. But guess what? In the 2020 budget that was brought by the PPP government, they had a deficit of $75 billion. 75 billion, and at that level, that was the highest single deficit in the history of this country. And that came about because of the destruction of the tax base in 2020. Not satisfied with that, on December 28th, they brought 2 additional spending bills, one for $985 million and the other one for $17+ billion. When you add that $18 billion to the $75 billion that they had at the budget time, that's $93 billion for the 2020 budget deficit. $93 billion, outstripping the 5 years of accumulated deficit by the coalition government. Let me give you another startling statistic.
Yeah.
In the 2019 budget speech, at around page 90 or in the appendices, you will see all the loans that were taken by the coalition government between 2015 and 2019. And several of those loans, over 100 million of that 462 million, were loans that were identified already by the previous government that were signed under the coalition government. But we treat them as ours. One of them was the East Coast Road, another one was the Ogle to Diamond Bypass Road, and so on. Those were loans that were in the making there, but that were signed by me when I went in there. But we call it ours. That's 462 million. Here's what I can tell you. Between August the 2nd and last week, the PPP government has already borrowed $215 million US. $250 million US in 5 months. At the moment, the IDB is working on a $34 million US loan for the energy sector loan that will be used, among other things, to do local content and bring in petroleum commission and so on. So when that comes through, that will be $250 million US in less than a year. And boards has been and tongues have been wagging that the government is talking to the IMF to draw on their contingency fund facility. That's another loan. So the loans are being taken left, right, wildfire. None of them yet for any developmental purpose, except for the one that we identified, Linden to Magura Road, that was given to them by the Caribbean Development Bank. So when we talk, Chris, we don't talk hot here, and we don't have trolls running around using out people based on personality and made up things about them. We bring facts and figures, and I want them to dispute. They're listening to this program, dispute facts that I've just put out there. That's the reality that is facing this country, and I wish we will have more commentators dispassionately looking at this matter rather than feeling that they have an obligation either A, to remain quiet, or B, not to say anything, or C, if they say something, it must be placatory.
Well said, well said. Cameron?
Absolutely well said. Look, it's the same thing that is being told here by that very authoritative source that we have in Winston Jordan was also what was told to us in Parliament by Winston Jordan when countering the arguments as to the Skeldon modernization for sugar development plan that the PPP had put, and wasted so much money from 2004 to 2014 or thereabouts. Over 100 and something million euros being taken and not being put in the sugar industry. And then going out, borrowing money from China and IDB and I think CDB and so on, all over the place. And they are lying. They have a very smart and clever public relations campaign in which they fool their supporters. They fool their supporters and they fool these middle-class businessmen that constitute a constituency of theirs who are getting all these tax deductions and so on. And that is what we have to, in a sense, counter. And we will try as best as possible tomorrow. I have written down some of the points that I will certainly adopt as coming from Winston Jordan. And Winston, there could not have been a greater lesson for me this afternoon. And the history, I got a piece of paper here and all over the paper, right? You know, I hope I could put it in a proper narrative. But it's wonderful to get that kind of lecture. And of course, Chris, you got to play this thing. I want this program here for Borbies too, so that I can go to the heartland and play it in Skeldon and play it in New Amsterdam. Because when these fellas, especially Barajagdeo and then Ashley done with you, you'd want to know where it is that these fellas could be so persuasive with their lying tongues and their forked tongues. And I like how Vincent just put it, the mantra of borrow and spend that is now attached to them when they were criticizing us for having the revenue base by expanding the enforcement of all the existing taxes and bring it into the 2015 dollarization. Because remember, taxes were since 1956 on the books, and $20 for a license and things like that. $20 Ghana dollars or $2 Ghana. He brought it up to the 2015 value. And that is what they're saying, that we tax the people too much, 100 taxes and all kinds of nonsense. But it did have an impact. I know a lot of people say, but why I pass so much a tax for, especially in the estate areas and so on. And so, but when we gonna go and tell them how much them are borrow now, I might have to get Chetty Jagan's quotations on how borrowings can make you a beggar, literally make you a beggar. He always denounced that. But they don't care. Bharat and so on don't care about Chetty now. All of that gone, all the lessons that we were taught. So it's an extremely good lesson here from Winston Jordan. Thanks very much.
Excellent, excellent. Mr. Jordan, closing remarks, because I know tomorrow, as Kemraj pointed out, he himself and colleagues will be debating in the House of Parliament. But of course, the UP will use the majority. Your closing remarks?
Well, my closing remarks will be that my view of Parliament is perhaps well known by now. I really consider Parliament to be a dud. We will not get our story told in Parliament. And so I believe now we have to go to the People's Parliament, whether it be at Durban Park, whether it be at Stabroek Market Square, whether it be at Buxton and so on. We have to go to the People's Parliament and sell this story. It's a waste of time in Parliament trying to tell the story because you will be drowned out by the nonsense. You don't have a very speaker who you can depend on to arbitrate these matters in a manner that allows you to make your position. And that is my view, of course, that it doesn't have to be a coalition view. I believe there's no substitute to go out to the People's Parliament and sell your ideas and sell your story where you are unfettered by any speaker, right? As to the truth being told to these people, and you're not fettered by a time and so on. That will be my view. There's a lot to say. Look, taxpayers have to end up paying this money. The bulk of taxpayers are usually public servants.
That's right.
public servants. And for public servants, this must be a scary story, because ultimately they do not be the beneficiaries of many of these projects.
That's right.
That are being claimed. Many of the beneficiaries will be those who either don't pay any taxes or skirt taxes. So public servants and their representatives, civil society and their representatives, and all other people ought to be putting up opposition to this ceiling. Again, as I said, I don't mind the ceiling being raised, but to be raised to these levels suggests that a borrowing spree is being planned. And for this country, a country, by the way, that is accumulating large sums of resources in the natural resource fund that we are proud of as a government to have set up.
Yes.
Monies that are available for spending instead of taking all these small PIA loans, available for spending our money that is earning virtually zero interest in the Federal Reserve Bank at the moment. And for which also we wrote a Natural Resource Fund Act that does not allow you to borrow against the deposits.
Yeah.
Does not allow you to borrow. We looking and see this borrowing spree that is projected to take place, while all that money sitting down there, watching us and asking us what you all doing about it.
That is as best as we could end this program here, Chris, because it is so true. That natural resource fund, I don't know, it's about 200 million US dollars it already has in it. So that I concur, and that's my closing remark.
Winston Jordan, former Mr. Cameron, that you can hear me. Tomorrow in the National Assembly, amongst several.
I'm fine.
Sure, yeah, go ahead, Cameron.
Will we be there tomorrow? As a matter of fact, very successful.
All right, we seem to have lost Cameron. Mr. Jordan, I thank you very much for being on the afternoon rush. As I mentioned to the viewers, tomorrow in the National Assembly, amongst several bills and motions that will be coming to the House, includes the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act, and as discussed, the raising of the internal and external debt ceiling. Mr. Jordan, it's always a pleasure to have you on the program, and I know for certain that tomorrow we will bring you back to give a recap on SEAM. I'd like to thank yourself and Mr. Kemad Ramjatan for joining the afternoon rush. We invite you viewers back here tonight at 8 p.m. To be ringside, on which my colleague Sherrod Duncan will be leading the discourse then. Until then, have a pleasant rest of your afternoon. Goodbye for now.